I spent most of my life in schools. I taught for 26 years, and for 16 of those I was head of two schools, an independent secondary and primary school in Glasgow of about 1,300 students, and then Wimbledon College, which is a comprehensive secondary boys' school in South London with about 1,500 students. And so I've spent my whole time in schools, and I think it's by far the best place to be. And so when I got to the end of my time as head of Wimbledon College, the provincial came and he said, well, what would you like to do next? And I thought, well, it'd be good to have a break. Come back to schools to have a break. So I said, well, I'd like to do something that is nothing to do with schools or education. And the following week, the letter arrived saying, I'd like you to be the provincial delegate for education. So obedience kicks in, and yes, Father, and this is what I'm now doing. So I'm responsible for the 11 Jesuit schools in the UK, and collaboratively do work with the schools of the other provinces in Europe. So I'm very fortunate in that I get to travel to nice places like Malta last week, or Denmark and Rome and Lithuania, and to help develop some of the schools there. What I want to share with you this morning are some thoughts about how, in very concrete ways, you can bring this idea of the light of Christ into your schools. And I want to start also with a quotation from Pope Francis speaking to young people on World Youth Day. And he's quoting St. Paul, and he says, "Put on Christ in your life, and you'll find a friend in whom you can always trust. Put on Christ, and you will see the wings of hope spreading and letting your journey with joy towards the future. Put on Christ, and your life will be full of his love. It will be a fruitful life." And I think in his teaching and in his preaching, Francis is very careful to use metaphors and images that are very practical. And he picks up this idea of Paul sort of putting on a coat, putting on a jacket or something. And Paul is saying, this is what you need to do with Christ. It's all about this encounter with Christ. How do you put on the jacket of Christ in your school in very practical ways? And I want to do it through 5 reflections. And the first one is about your role as school leaders. And I think at the start of a headship, this is very much what we feel like. We sort of know what we're about, a bit scary, but we know what we want to do. We've seen other school leaders make a hash of it and take things in the wrong direction, so we want to do it correctly and properly. This is the school of the future. This is also how we feel very much, I think, at the beginning of the year when we're fresh and we go at things with a new eye. And it doesn't take very long, I think, sometimes for that energy to sort of deflate slightly, and this is probably something like you're feeling at the moment towards the end of the year. So we're asking questions about where does the energy come for you to maintain that first image rather than the second image. So what does leadership in a Catholic school look like, and does it differ from leadership in any other school? Let's think about that for a moment. What does Catholic leadership look like, and is it distinct? And I think the answer is very clearly yes, and I want to suggest in what way I think that's true. If you are trained as a school leader in general, people would talk about the roles that you have in terms of leadership and the roles that you have in terms of management. And this became a big deal in schools, I suppose, at the end of the 80s and into the early 90s, looking at those fairly distinct approaches to the job of being a school leader. If you go to the Harvard Business School, this is what they will tell you leadership is about. So this is about $100,000 worth of MBA here in just one single page. This is John Cotter, who's in charge of the Harvard Business School, and he would say, well, what leaders do is they establish direction, they align people, they motivate and they inspire, and then they produce change, often to a dramatic extent. In that aligning people, it's very much important to have a vision. If you don't have a vision, you get people pulling in different directions. Good people, as David was saying earlier, acting by their lights, wanting to do the right thing, but nonetheless not helping the institution because we're not all focused and facing in the same direction. What I want to suggest is that in a Catholic school we add another sphere, and that is the sphere of influence. And the sphere of influence is what makes it different. So just thinking about this a little bit. Management. If I'm talking to new heads and to new senior leaders, I say you've got to have management skills. You've got to be able to have policies and systems and structures. You've got to be able to evaluate. There are compliance issues. You've got to manage change. And all of these sorts of things require technical skills that you can be taught. And there are a few questions at the bottom that might help you focus on that. So what are the three main things that you manage? Are they the right things? What are the three management tasks that take up most of your time, most of your energy? When I was a head of year in a school, one of the most significant things that was said to me is that the deputy head for pastoral care came in one day to the assembled meeting of all the heads of year. And he said, here are the lists of all the boys, it was a boys' school, all the boys in your year groups, so my 180. So could you just put a cross by the dozen that take up most of your time? Well, we all went, that was it, done within about 10 seconds. And then he said, now could you put a tick next to the boys that you don't really know? And then we all started realizing quite how many there were. And he said, what I want you to do for the next week is I want you to ignore the top 12 problems. He said, unless it's murder or arson, you are not to get involved. And I want you to choose 12 of the boys you ticked, and I want you to spend all your times and energies this week getting to know them. And it was a transformative thing in the school. It was a management skill. And things like that are obviously important. Leadership has a slightly different focus. Here we're talking about devising and articulating the vision. We're about encouraging that shared vision so people aren't rowing in opposite directions. It's about strategic development. And that involves people skills. Good leaders have good people skills. And again, there are some questions you might think about there. Well, who do you think you lead? There's a very obvious answer to that. But who's following? And for what purpose? Why are you doing this apart from the paycheck? And how does your leadership manifest itself? And then ask your question, well, what's your leadership like at its best? And what's it like at its worst? And then ask a few people on your staff that you trust, and you might be surprised. But what I want to suggest is that this middle area, which lies between the wings of leadership and management, this area of influence, is enormously important. And in the normal sort of secular understanding of this, it's something to do with example and imitation, modeling behavior, coaching. And this, I think, in a Catholic Christian school, comes from your spirituality. And the questions here are about questions of, well, who has influenced you in your life? Who influences you now? Where do you draw that energy, that spirit, that commitment, that vision from your school from? These are different sorts of questions. And I think if we're honest as heads, most of us are pretty good on the management skills side of things. We do courses, we have certificates. Most of us are pretty good on the leadership side. We wouldn't actually survive in the job unless we could lead people in the direction that we want them to go in. But I think for a lot of heads, this middle area of the resourcing of myself so that my influence may be clear and effective and good, that area perhaps we're not so good at resourcing. Thinking about that leadership role in a Christian community, I think it's very important to be clear what the Christian take on this is. And very often we get this wrong. There's an awful lot of stuff, and I hope I'm not attacking anybody who's written this stuff in the room, but there's an awful lot of stuff, for example, written about servant leadership. And this is really, in a sense, quite iniquitous, because servant leadership does not occur in Scripture. What we're doing is we are combining two ideas, one from the secular world and one from particularly the Old Testament world, and saying, can we somehow baptize or Christianize leadership? Now that may be a good thing to do, and it may be a useful thing to do. But I think if you go to the New Testament does not use at any point the word leadership or leader. It just doesn't occur. The word that it does use is this idea of episcope or oversight. And Paul is very clear that this leadership in a Christian community consists explicitly of two things. First of all, it's about enabling people. So the question, if you're a leader in a Christian community, is do you, by your influence, enable other people to grow and be themselves and for them to be the presence of Christ in your school? So if you think it's down to you, it's not going to go very far. Heads quite like to be thought of as God. I certainly did. However, we actually need lots of Christs in the school, not one God. And the other element that Paul talks about is this idea of reconciling and healing. Are you the person who picks up the pieces, who sets people back on their feet, who gets them going again? Because that's the other, for St. Paul, that's the other key element of what it means to be a leader in any Christian community. And sometimes when I do this with governors, I say to them, is that your impression of your head teacher? Is your head teacher somebody who enables? Can you tell me who do they enable and to what effect? And is your head teacher somebody who picks up the pieces, reconciles and heals within that community? Because that's the distinctively Christian bit of it. They've got to have the management skills, they've got to have the leadership skills, they've got to understand how to block drains, but do they have this? Is that there? And when you start thinking about that, you start realizing that this is the model that Jesus himself used. The scene from Emmaus, where Jesus comes up beside these two apostles, and he listens to them first. He listens to what they've been through, what their concerns and their worries are, about how their whole world has fallen apart. And then he simply draws in the tradition of the breaking of bread, and it's in this that they suddenly recognize Christ is here, present in our midst. And I think that's very much the model for leadership in a Catholic or a Christian community. It's this idea of accompaniment, of listening, of enabling, and then sorting things out so that they can be healed when they're broken. So a couple of questions. First of all, do you take time to nurture yourself explicitly as the leader of a Christian community? And secondly, what resources do you think are at your disposal to do that? And how do you source those resources? So maybe just spend 2 minutes talking to the person next to you. I think it's very important that school leaders do take time to think about that and to say, who do I have the conversations with that talk about the sorts of things that David Wells was speaking about this morning? Now, is it simply I come along to a conference like this, maybe once every however often, and I hear this stuff, and it renews and it excites and it inspires and so on, and I try to carry it away. But who's the person or people with whom you have that regular conversation that keeps Christ at the centre? What are the sources for that? And I think that's really quite a tricky one that heads in Catholic schools need to address. Out of the National Catholic Head Teachers Retreats that have happened for the last few years, we've had more and more people asking for spiritual accompaniment or spiritual direction. We've just this year set up a course to train people to accompany Catholic heads and to have those sorts of conversations who will be competent to do so. And one of the things that is staggering is that within a month or so of setting up this training course, which is on the course there, we've had so many requests coming in. We've got around 200 Catholic heads on the waiting list, and 2 whole dioceses have suddenly said, could you do all our heads? And so we're looking at how we can expand this hugely, because I think unless you've got somebody that you're talking to about these things, really it's very, very difficult. You feel very alone, you feel very under-resourced, I think, often as a head. So that's the first area. The second area I want to talk about is the apostolic core. And this is a notion that we're talking about in the Jesuit schools a lot. There are 2,500 Jesuit schools across the world and 900 universities. And this is something that we're really focusing on at the moment. And it's really asking about the reactions that you get to this idea of Jesus Christ at the centre of the school. It's asking the question, who in your school is really at that apostolic core? And I want to explain it by looking at Sunday Mass. If you observe what goes on at Sunday Mass, you will see that some people put themselves front and centre. These people are usually male, they usually dress up, and they talk a lot. You'll then see there's a group of people who often put themselves in the front pews. Now, my observation was often that these people had extremely well and often expensively dressed children, and on the whole brought the Mass book with them, so they didn't need the piece of paper that they were offered as they came in. They can also have quite an influence, incidentally, on the priest. There was one famous ex-general who used to sit in the front row at Farm Street, and he would, at the beginning of Mass, get out his collection and put it, this was a long time ago, you can tell, put all the coins along the bench in front of him, and then as the priest started preaching, he'd listen for about a minute, and then the first pound coin would go back in his pocket. And then we have another layer. These are the good, normal Catholics, it seems to me, who perhaps sometimes arrive slightly late, whose children are generally slightly unruly, and who don't know the words to the creed, but they kind of fill up the middle of the church. And then you have the people, generally, any younger ones, teenagers that are there, who'll hide behind the pillars and generally keep out of the way. You have these layers. And I think different people feel comfortable in the distance, not just physically, but mentally, spiritually, that they sit from the altar. And don't make the mistake that the priests actually always like to be up the front. I can remember when I was head many years ago, I was having a pretty torrid time when it came to Holy Week, and the last thing I wanted was Holy Week. And I sort of suffered through Maundy Thursday with the inept parish priest sort of getting it all wrong and so on. On Good Friday, I thought, I've had it. I am going to an Anglican cathedral where it will be done properly. So I went to the Anglican cathedral, and I was in the back row. Again, I wanted to be well out of the way, so I was in the back row. I wasn't dressed as a priest or anything. There I was in the back row. And I was very aware there was another person, a man, sitting a bit down, and he didn't have a hymn book, so I just sort of unconsciously sort of shared my hymn book with him. And at the end of the hymn, I closed the book and looked at him, and it was the Archbishop of Canterbury. And both of us said to the other, "What are you doing here?" And both of us were escaping from having to be up front and centre and dressed up and speak and all the rest of it. And I think this is a good model to think about the church and people's involvement with the church. Not everybody in your school is going to feel front and centre on the religious identity, the Catholic identity of the school. And a little exercise that we do with teachers in our schools, I don't expect you to read this, I just want you to get the impression, is we get them to fill in this. We get them to say, where on these circles do you place yourself? If you place yourself at the middle here, you're saying, I am a completely paid-up, card-carrying Roman Catholic. I believe everything the church teaches. I go to Mass every Sunday and possibly during the week as well. My children have all been indoctrinated, da-di-da-di-da-di-da. If you put yourself towards the edge, you say, well, I was born a Catholic, but I don't really go to Mass. I'm really not sure about quite a lot of what the church teaches, and so on and so forth. And of course, if you're not a Catholic, you don't even get onto the circle, right? You're outside the circle. And often, teachers in our schools, Catholic or not Catholic, can think about the school in those terms. We can often unconsciously articulate it in that way. And then we give them a second sphere, or set of circles to fill in. And this is about your commitment as a teacher. I put in an enormous amount of work to this school. I go way beyond contractual duties. I'm there at the crack of dawn. I leave at midnight. I know every single child in my class. I work like anything. Right? And then the one on the outside, I arrive at 1 minute to 9. I don't know the names of any kids in my classes. I do the minimum amount of work, and I leave as soon as the bell goes at the end of the day and roll on my pension. I've never met a teacher like that. Some people can sometimes talk about our colleagues like that, but I've never met a teacher like that. When you actually sit down and talk to them, teachers put themselves at the middle. Now, different people have different capacity for generosity in the eyes of others, but often in their own eyes, they are giving all they've got. Now, these semicircles are two halves of the same thing. If we're genuinely claiming that our schools are Catholic communities, then they're the same thing. If you're a bloody good teacher, you are at the very heart. You don't need to be up front and centre at Mass. Other people will do that. But you are nonetheless at the very heart of the school. And I think there's a conversation to be had there with teachers, which is very important about how they see themselves in relation to the school. And to begin to understand that the identity of a Catholic school is not just about the overt, high articulation, theological understanding of that. There can be much, much more basic ways of looking at that. It's a bit like this. Sure, I follow the herd, but not out of brainless obedience, mind you, but out of a deep and abiding respect for the concept of community. What we need to recognise is that the flock we're responsible for, whether it's the children or whether it's the staff, are very varied. Sheep come in all kinds, different sorts of shapes and sizes. And therefore, different people will make different contributions. I don't want everybody on the liturgy committee. I want some of them out there running bloody good rugby teams. Yeah? So it's making sure you've got that mix and balance, but it is making sure that you know who your apostolic core is. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, if you think about the identity and mission of your school as a Catholic school explicitly, who are the key people in your school who make that happen, who are that? Now, we're not saying they're more important than the person who runs rugby and is not doing that, but do you know who those people are at the apostolic core? It seems to me it's people who think this way. We're not human beings having a spiritual experience, we're spiritual beings having a human experience. Who are the people on your staff who instinctively get that? And again, we're not saying they're better than others, we're simply saying that's quite a good little indicator that these are the ones who are going to help you develop and nurture and maintain that explicitly Catholic Christian identity of your school. Something seems to have happened. Good, thank you. At one of the schools that I was privileged to be head of, this was one of the apostolic core. Her name is Sonia, and she is the cook, the chief cook. And she undoubtedly embodies the Catholic identity of that school. She would be absolutely appalled to know that I was talking about her, and that photograph had to be taken surreptitiously by a year 7 who wasn't a suspect. She would be appalled at the idea that she was part of the apostolic core. She wouldn't really have a sense of what that meant, but she absolutely is. She was the person that the boys would go to if they had problems or issues. She was the one who was always in cahoots with the deputy head, you know, work of the devil if ever I saw it, who would know the kids who were in trouble, and she would be challenging them as they came in for their lunch. You know, you're not getting chips unless you sort out that classroom behavior. You know, it was staggering. But she was somebody who brought that love and that hope and that faith into the school big time. And so she would be on my list. This isn't a list that's published anywhere. She would be on my list as a member of that apostolic core. She was somebody who was absolutely at the heart of that Christian community. So 2 questions for you. First of all, who's the apostolic core of your community? And it's not necessarily the school leadership team. And secondly, and this is the important thing, once you know who the apostolic core are, do you put in their way opportunities for their personal development? Are they able to come away and do a retreat day? Do you put literature into their hands very deliberately? Do you allow them or invite them to join in a prayer group? Do you send them away to learn how to do children's liturgy? Whoever they are, do you give them the resources specifically and in a targeted way that enables them to grow as individuals so that they really can be the apostolic core of your school? Okay, 2 minutes for a quick discussion. The notion that Pope Francis was talking about putting on Christ. How do I put on Christ in my school? What I'm suggesting is that one of the ways is identify your apostolic core. Don't publicize it. You're not putting up notices saying these people are at the apostolic core here and the rest of you are heretics and so on. These are the apostolic core people, and these are the people that, in terms of building up that Catholic identity and mission of the school, those are the people that you try to resource so that they carry on doing, well, what they're doing. Third area I want to talk about is education and formation. And I think one of the things that we really face, which is a huge difficulty, is this idea that schools are only about education. And certainly in the Catholic Christian tradition, that has never been the case. Education is good, education is important. But the formation of human beings is an equally important role in our schools. And often, because of Ofsted targets and all the rest of it, that formation side gets squeezed out of our schools. I want you to do a little exercise for a moment. Think of a young person, preferably somebody in your school, but maybe somebody who left a number of years ago, who you know that you really admire. a good person, a fine human being. Got someone? Okay. And then just ask yourself, I'm not going to tell anyone else this at the moment, what qualities you think that person has, just in your head. Okay? Right. When he came to Britain and talked to all those young people at the big assembly at Twickenham, Benedict said, my question for you, to the young people, is this. What kind of person would you really like to be? And this is the key formation question. This is one of the questions that we ought to be asking young people at every stage through their career in our schools. What sort of person do you want to be? What kind of person are you growing into? What does that look like? If you take a child at the beginning of the school, what are you going to add? How are you going to form them so that they become that young person who leaves the school that you are proud of for all the right reasons? We did some work on this in the Jesuit schools, and we came up with something that we call the Jesuit pupil profile. And what it is it's a series of 8 pairs of virtues. And this is the first part of it. And the idea is that we want to articulate really clearly, using absolutely specific words, what we hope the young people in our schools are coming to be. I just want to take the first one just to illustrate how this works. We want them to be generous, grateful for their own gifts, for the gift of other people, and for the blessings of each day. We want them to be generous with their gifts, becoming men and women for others. Now this is loaded with Jesuit jargon. Unless you're in the Jesuit system, you won't recognize that some of it is very Jesuit. The 2 words grateful and generous represent the beginning and the end of St. Ignatius' spiritual exercises. It's where he starts and it's where he ends. So the kinds of things that we're talking about with pupils, according to their age, something like this, gratitude. Ignatius says you always start anything by articulating what you are grateful for. Now, people in the world, it seems to me, divide into 2 groups. There are people who have an idea of entitlement, and there are people who have an idea of gratitude. And entitlement is very alluring, particularly for teenagers. So this is the view that says, what am I entitled to? What are my terms and conditions? What unfair loads are being put on me by the leadership of the school? Why can't I do that? Why has she got this and I don't have this? It's that corner of the staff room that see everything wrong in very personal terms. We do some of this with whole staffs in schools, and it's very interesting because we do this thing before the morning break. You go into the staff room and nobody is sitting in the corner any longer. They've all sort of hoofed it out. The gratitude idea is, well, instead of thinking about what you're entitled to and what's going wrong, think about, well, what do I have to be grateful for? And when you start thinking, well, there's my health, and there's my family, and I've got a job, and I work in this great school, and by and large it's quite well led, and I've got these fantastic kids, and I'm reasonably well off, and I've got a pension, and you start thinking, hang on, whoa, 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 whoa. It gives you a whole different perspective on the world from the entitlement one. The entitlement one is what David Wells was talking about as small-mindedness, whereas adopting that attitude of gratitude opens things up. And we do that with the students in the school. We stop every day, just for a few moments, and we think about what's gone really well today? What have you got to be grateful for today? What are the blessings of today? It transforms the way people think completely, just in 1 minute a day. In terms of generosity, one of the things we're trying to do with this is get kids and staff in the schools to identify with these words and use these words such that they become their vocabulary. And generosity is a very big one for Ignatius. Ignatius says, once you realize all those things that we were talking about in terms of gratitude, you cannot help but be generous. There's one teacher in particular, an art teacher at Wimbledon College, who gets this absolutely. It's sort of built into him. And somebody was telling me of a case where he was teaching his art class, he'd done the introduction, and he said to the boys, right, now you need to get a paintbrush from over there, and the first boy got up, got a paintbrush and came and sat down. Nothing wrong, followed instructions, excellent. The next boy went up, picked up the pot, and walked around the room, unbidden. And Nick would immediately observe and say, see that? That's generosity. Nothing wrong with what the first boy did, but that's generosity. That's what we're looking for. And it's a matter of building that into our classes and the way we talk with young people. In one of the primary schools at the bottom end, they built a tree. You'll see an image of this in a minute, a tree with these words. Because a lot of these words very young children won't particularly get. But what they do is, when you do a generous thing, they write it on one of those sort of gift pack discs, and then they hang it on the generous branch. I mean, I'm not a primary teacher, but that strikes me as very clever. You could do that in sixth form, I think. And then these are the other ones. So what we've done is after 18 months of hard work with the chaplaincy teams of the schools and the heads and senior leadership teams, we've come up with this vocabulary for describing what we're trying to do in the schools. And then we've translated that into an image, which some of you will recognize. If you're my age, you wouldn't have known what this was, but a tag cloud, so the kids instantly recognize and know what this is trying to say. So you put these words together and said, this is what we're trying to grow in you, and of course in the staff. And so we talk about this constantly. So if you go into a Jesuit school, you will see this appears almost at the beginning of every single assembly, and a word will come out and the assembly will be based around the one word. It's what we use to describe the people that we're hoping the children are growing into. And it's done as a tree because often bits will fall off or die. You know, we get less generous at a particular phase, but more truthful or something. And so it's trying to describe some sort of organic process that works in that way. But it is trying to articulate something which is explicitly from the values of the gospel. See faith, hope, and love there. It's also coming through the Ignatian, the Jesuit tradition. So this is something particularly for our schools. Although a number of dioceses have now adopted this and produced their own version. And it works. It's something that staff recognize, it's something that pupils can work with. And also, if you look at that, if you've got children who are not Catholics or not Christians, you can have people who are fairly anti-Catholic, anti-Christian. And if you talk to parents or colleagues in that position and you say, is there any of that you disagree with? Would you like your child to grow up without hope? You know, do you want your child to have no faith in him or herself or anybody else? Do you not want them to be eloquent? Do you want them to be bumbling and incompetent? You know, is that what? Of course you don't. You look at those. These are human values that everybody can subscribe to. But as Catholics, we look at it and say, well, we know where that's from. It's from the gospel and it's from the Ignatian tradition.
On the New York City subway, it's hard enough finding someone who will give up his seat to a stranger, let alone be willing to give up his life for one.
The train was coming in like that.
It happened just 50-year-old Wesley Autry, a construction worker and Navy veteran, was standing on a subway platform with his two little girls when right in front of them, a man started having a seizure.
He kind of stumbled and over his own feet and fall backwards. I see a train coming, but the train is so close, I'm like, what do I do?
Wesley jumped onto the tracks and thought if he could just lie on top of the man, keep him from flailing, maybe the train would roll right over both of them. The clearance was exactly 21 inches. Wesley and the man, 20 and a half.
No way the train can stop before this gentleman could get him up off the tracks. So he covered him with his body and pushed him down to a point where the train wouldn't hit his head and held him down under the tracks while the train came and rolled right over the top.
It gave Wesley's children the scare of their young lives.
I thought he was going to get killed.
And Wesley, the scare of his too.
I'm like talking to him, sir, you can't move. I got two kids up here looking for the father to come back. I don't know you, you don't know me, but listen, don't panic. You know, I'm here to save you.
As for the guy Wesley saved, he's 20-year-old Cameron Hollipter, and other than a few scrapes and bruises, his father says he's doing fine.
Mr. Autry's instinctive and unselfish act saved our son's life.
You know, the word hero gets thrown around a lot nowadays.
What a better way to start off the new year than to save a life.
Nice to be reminded of what one really looks like. Steve Hartman, CBS News, New York.
What Wesley Autry did was perhaps an extreme example of generosity, of that virtue of being generous. But what you usually observe is that didn't come out of nowhere. This wasn't a man who suddenly committed this enormous act of generosity. I bet you if you look at his life, there are hundreds of thousands of little acts of generosity. So that when it came to it, he instinctively acted in that selfless, generous way and put himself in harm's way. And that's something about virtues, and what we're trying to do in our schools is to say it's by constantly talking about these and pointing out the little examples of these in everyday school life that children gradually come to be these things. They grow into this way of being. There's a whole branch of psychology that you may be aware of called positive psychology, which has grown up in the last 20 or 30 years, particularly people like Martin Seligman. And positive psychology is a branch of psychology that tries to say, up until now, psychology has been about mad people, about people who've got problems of one sort or another. And what psychologists in this school are trying to do now is to say, well, let's look at people who do not have mental health problems. Let's look at people who are happy and fulfilled and successful. What makes them that and other people something else? So doing some research there. And what they keep coming back to is what they call character strengths, what we call these virtues. And there are some specific things that the positive school of psychology says about these. That if you have virtues, almost whatever they are, that generates in you a sense of ownership. It gives you an identity. And surely that's part of what we're trying to do in schools. Encourage children to develop a sense of their identity. It also impels behaviours, and you saw that in a spectacular way with Wesley Autry. You know, if I am somebody who is generous, if that's how I tend to behave, then when the opportunity arises, I will be a generous person. A very interesting piece of research done by Ipsos Mori a number of years ago, which showed that Catholic children or children who'd been to a Catholic school were 7% more likely to give to charity than children who had not, young people who had not been to a Catholic school. Now, why is that? Is that because Catholics are more virtuous than other people? No, of course not. Why it is because one of the hallmarks of Catholic schools is we're collecting for CAFOD, we're doing this. Catholic schools have that. Every Catholic school has that in spades. Whereas in other schools that is often the case, but is not always the case. There is a lesser version of that. So people who have been through Catholic schools were shown, this was a very significant piece of research, to actually be different people because of the experience of Catholic education that they had had. Also, virtues are buildable, not like talents. I mean, however much you think you're going to play for England, however much you think, you know, you're going to perform a piano concerto on a world stage, if you actually haven't got it, you're not going to do it. Whereas with virtues, it works very, very differently. The more you practice virtue, the more virtuous you become. Of course, this is Aristotle. If you read the Nicomachean Ethics, it starts off by asking the great question, well, what's a good person? What's virtue? And all your philosophy A-level students get really interested in this, and you say to them, you're going to be really disappointed with the answer, you know. And we get to the end of the book, and what makes you a good person? Being a good person. And all the kids feel desperately cheated at this point. It's actually doing it that creates it and grows it in you. And also, virtues are for their own strength. And this is sounding profoundly Christian. I don't do virtue because it makes me a better person. I do virtue because it makes sense in itself. And then the Aristotelian point at the end. So what we're finding, even though we've only had this running for about a year, is this is becoming a very, very powerful tool for talking with teachers and children about that formation element of schools. So go back and think of the person you thought of. Did that person have any of these qualities? And almost certainly the answer is yes, they had these qualities in bucket loads. So I think it's worth thinking hard about that idea of encouraging virtue in schools. So a couple of questions. How do you articulate the value and virtues you wish to grow in your pupils? I can't find a better way of putting it. Develop sounds too technical and cold. Does everyone in the school share a vision for this and a common language? We've found that adopting these 16 words has made a massive difference We don't say to people, you can't use other words, but we won't pay you if you do. You need to be looking at these particular words. I was doing this with a huge group of teachers in Dutch schools. I want briefly to look at is this idea of agents of change. And one of the things that I think you notice is that young people are very generous, but are sometimes unfocused.
I think one of the problems with education in this country at the moment is that we don't really know what it's for. It gets instrumentalised, grades, results, league tables. But we've got to ask the question of, well, what are we educating people for? What do we want people to do with this education? And I think combined with that is that we don't really have a clear vision collectively as a society of what it means to be a good human being. We don't have a vision of the human person. Now in a Jesuit school, we do have a vision of the human person because that comes from Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ shows us what it is like to be fully alive and fully human. The purpose of the Jesuit education is to develop those gifts, to get to know God, but to be men and women for others. We hope that people are going to change the world or change just a very small part of it.
I think we would concede that Catholic schools might also have a vision of Christ. Dominican schools we might have a problem with, but I think what we're saying here is that this idea of being agents of change, this idea of being men and women for others, people who can make a difference to the world, either in big ways or in small ways, is a really important way of communicating that Catholic identity of our schools. In many places, particularly in the United States, in the Catholic education sector there, they are talking about that social outreach, being agents of change, as being the new door to the church. They're saying young people are not going to come to liturgy and worship and prayer and those sorts of things, though it's obviously still good to encourage them and do all of that. But this being able to make a difference, to actually put into practice those virtues and values we were talking about, is perhaps more important. So what can schools do? Well, raising awareness of issues, I think, is hugely important. Taking the time to actually notice what is going on in the world and commenting on that. Then focusing on the possible, and there's this slogan which I think was originally an Oxfam slogan, although I may be wrong, many, many years ago, this idea of think globally and act locally, which is a superbly educational way of looking at this, saying know about these big things that are going on in the world, but then find something at home that you can actually manageably do, particularly in primary schools. You know, you can't literally send them off to go and hunt for the girls who are missing in Nigeria, but what can you do? What's the equivalent in our own behaviour, in our own society? So it's thinking globally, but acting locally. Do something above all else. I think one of the things in secondary schools that teenagers might find most frustrating, we talk to sixth formers, it's when we have assemblies that tell us this, 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 and this, and we're kind of left feeling impotent. What can we do about it? The school actually has to assist them in finding ways in which they can do something, not just raising money. But then to reflect on what you're doing. This is the bit that often goes amiss. That we know about the problem, we raise money for it, we do something, but we don't then reflect and think about it. If we don't, it won't then change our habitual behaviours, and that's what we're really trying to do. And then relate it to the gospel. Say, this is Christian, you know. We were doing something in a school recently where we were using, believe it or not, the annual statistics that the Holy See publishes. And the kids were complaining, sixth formers, they were sort of saying, well, you know, all these priests in parishes and this formal religion and so on, you know, shouldn't you be helping the poor? And then we popped up the statistic that the Catholic Church runs roughly twice as many aid stations, refugee camps, clinics as it does parishes in the world, worldwide. And the kids went, oh, right, well, we didn't know that. And just that alone changed their attitude. Two examples. These pupils at Stonyhurst College, they were talking about the whole idea of poverty in certain parts of Africa and the inability of people to feed themselves. And so what they did was they came up with a solution that they got in touch with a particular Jesuit priest in a particular community, and they raised funds and they bought a fishing boat. And they named the fishing boat after their year, and this fishing boat now provides those local people with the means for feeding themselves. Those kids, there's a boy out there now, Ben Warlow is out there now, 3 years after leaving university, and is going to spend a year working in that area. It's about building those projects that aren't just one-offs, let's raise money for CAFOD's appeal this year, but follow through so that young people feel connected and they are making a difference. Just a little bit of difference in a little tiny part of the world, but a difference that's important. Again, when I was head at Wimbledon College, we wanted to do something about homelessness. There are 17,000 people sleep rough on the streets of London. Roughly half of them are young people. So what we decided to do was to do an overnight sleep out, which focused on homelessness.
We are sleeping out in these conditions and getting a very different experience to what we'd normally have, which is similar to an experience that a homeless person would have.
We got to see a real homeless person. He expressed how he felt, and it was pretty touching stuff. Oh, I'm definitely not prejudge homeless people, because you don't know what they've been through at all.
The homeless person that we had in talked about the areas in Wimbledon where he sleeps, and those are roads and streets that our boys walk along every day. And you could see it kind of clicking in the boys' heads. Oh, I walked down that street. I've probably walked past this man and I've never seen.
It suddenly taught me not to judge straight away and to think twice before assuming I know what they're going through and what they've been through.
We hope that the experience and the built-in reflection we offer gives an opportunity for them to respond in some way. We hope it elicits some action in them. We hope it elicits some of the creativity out of them to want to act and be agents of change, be men and women for others in various ways.
There is that real, lived out, talked about Catholic faith that's alive in the college, and the boys know it as part of their day-to-day life. It's not added on, it's fundamental to what goes on in the college.
I think one of the problems with education in this country at the moment.
So I showed that because I think, how do you put on Christ in a school? By having things like that. You know, we try to make events like that programmed through the boys' years in the school. And when they leave, that's what they talk about. That's the thing that had the impact. As teachers, it's very hard to say, it wasn't my philosophy lessons that stayed with them. It was that one single night that they slept out in the pouring rain, and a homeless person came to talk to them. And what the film doesn't say is the homeless person was 17, he was the same age as they were. And that just blew their minds. And you could see in those people something changed. A virtue grew. I won't judge people in the same way anymore, says Matthew. Yeah. So it's by engineering things like that in our schools that I think we actually develop those virtues, grow those virtues in young people. I'm acutely conscious of the time, so I'll just give you the questions and then we'll move on. So what opportunities do your pupils have to change the world? Or a very small part of it? And a small part of it's fine, but you need to say it, right? We're not going to change the world today, but we are going to do this bit. Keep doing a lot of bits, something happens. And does that principle of think globally, act locally, because it's a superbly educational principle, does that inform the way that you plan activity in your school? Okay. So, moving on to the last part, building up the church. This is another role for Catholic schools. It is about building up the church, and I'm very acutely aware that in some of your schools, many of the pupils aren't Catholic. In a sense, that doesn't matter. Well, the way we would look at this is, can they contribute to whatever their faith community is, or simply to the good of the community, the wider community? But talking particularly about the Catholics in the schools, because I think often we fail them. I was quite shocked a while ago, a former pupil who's now in the seminary in Rome, said to me, well, when I was at your school, we didn't get any religion, and we were all thinking we were sort of, dolloping it on, and I was always saying, let's be careful here, how many masses we expect them to go to, and how much RE there is. The bishop saying 10% RE and all of this sort of thing. And he was, well, we had no religion, whereas the staff, I think, would have thought we had enormous amounts of religion, but for him it wasn't enough. And it's getting that balance, isn't it? Introduce you to Vilfredo Pareto, who was a fairly early ecologist, an Italian. And he noticed that 20% of pea pods contain 80% of peas, or that 20% of Italians own 80% of the land. And he published this in a very obscure journal. Somebody came along a little bit later, this man, Uran, and he took this principle, he called it the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule. Some of you may have come across this. It's widely used in business schools. And there does seem to be a sort of relationship that 20% of the customers that you may have in a business will generate 80% of your income. Or, the heads might jump on this one, 20% of your workforce generate 80% of the significant output of the school. There does seem to be this 20-80 relationship. It's not quite as bad as John the 23rd, who, when he'd just been made Pope after a few weeks, was asked how many people worked at the Vatican, and he replied about half of them. This Pareto principle was taken up by a sociologist in the United States called Matthew Kelly. And he's done a very, very extensive piece of research. It now includes hundreds of thousands of subjects. And he said, can you apply this to Catholic parishes? Is it true that roughly 20% of your parishioners generate 80% of your income, 80% of the work, and so on? And what he actually found was this, that 6.8% of parishioners give 80% of income, 6.4% of parishioners contribute 80% of what the parish does, and there's an 84% overlap between those two groups. So not 20%, but roughly 7% of people actually are the Catholic parishes of the United States. And he calls these, in a rather horrible American way, dynamic Catholics. I think he means the ones who have energy and are engaged. And the question that he has since asked, and this is a major, major thing in American parishes, is what is it about the 7%? What do they do? What do they think? What do they believe that's different from what the 93% do think and believe? And that's the basis of the research that's been ongoing. And what he comes up with is this. He says there are 4 signs or 4 qualities of engaged Catholics. They pray, they study, they're generous, and they evangelize. And this is not rocket science. You could have thought of this for yourself, but his research significantly backs that up. He says highly engaged, what he calls dynamic Catholics, have 4 things in common. So let's look at this. He says that they pray, and the distinction is that the 93% say prayers when they need something, and the 7% say prayers. Is that something we can do in our schools? Because an awful lot of prayer in schools is when we need something. Study. On average, a dynamic Catholic spends 14 minutes a day reading a book or a newspaper or a journal, something to do with faith. Do we encourage that in our youngsters? Do we do that ourselves? Generosity. We saw the figures for generosity. And he says it's quite clear these people are generous not just with their money, but with their time, with their energy, with their kindness. We can encourage that in schools. And also evangelism. This was the one in his book that he says Catholics are most uncomfortable with. It was really interesting hearing David Wells talk about, as soon as we start talking about Jesus, it was all kind of evangelical, and we're not very comfortable with that. And that's exactly what he says, Matthew Kelly says. He says that these Catholics, they do talk about their faith to other people. It naturally comes into conversation, but they still find this one is the most difficult. That's not a bad model for thinking about your school as a Catholic school. Where are the opportunities to learn to pray? Where are the opportunities where we study in a sort of self-directed way? Where's the generosity? Where's the evangelism? It's not a bad way of beginning to think about, that's how you put on the jacket of Jesus Christ in a school, by looking at those sorts of areas. So again, just a couple of questions. What does your school do to build up the church? And what counts as being Catholic in your school? We've run out of time, I'm afraid. We started slightly late, but possibly take away, think about those things. I think often when we're presented with this idea of, how do you build a Catholic community, how do you build a Catholic school, we can think that it's beyond us. We can almost be defeated by it. And yet I don't think it's rocket science. I think there are lots of models out there, and it's simply a matter of seizing on one of them and saying, this year let's concentrate on this pair of virtues. Let's concentrate on being a school of prayer, how we teach people to pray. It's a matter of simply grabbing something and going with it. And in that way, I think you really can transform schools. It's all that we're talking about at the beginning, putting on Christ, actually making Christ present in the school, passing on the faith in very concrete ways. And that's it. Thank you very much for being patient listening.